In the heart of Washington, D.C., where the pulse of the nation beat strongest amid marble halls and towering monuments, there stood an exclusive restaurant known simply as the Hawthorne Club, a sanctuary for those who moved in the circles of power and influence. The air inside carried the rich aroma of seared prime cuts and aged wines, mingling with the faint notes of polished wood and fresh linens that draped every table. Soft golden lighting from crystal fixtures above cast gentle shadows across the room, creating an atmosphere of refined intimacy where conversations rarely rose above a murmur, and every detail spoke of quiet luxury. It was the sort of place where senators, executives, and diplomats gathered not just to eat, but to unwind or seal unspoken agreements. The kind of establishment that felt worlds away from the everyday rhythms of life most Americans knew. On this particular evening, as the city lights outside began to sparkle against the darkening sky, a man in his early 70s pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside with the unhurried stride of someone seeking nothing more than a brief escape from the relentless demands of public life. John Neely Kennedy, the United States Senator from Louisiana and a steadfast member of the Republican Party, had come here alone, driven by a simple yet profound need for solitude after yet another exhausting day on Capitol Hill. The Senate session that afternoon had dragged on for hours, filled with heated debates over budget allocations, infrastructure funding, and the endless tug-of-war between federal priorities and the real needs of working families back home. Kennedy had spoken passionately in committee, drawing on decades of experience to argue for policies that would actually help the small towns and rural communities he represented, the places where folks still believed in hard work, neighborly kindness, and keeping promises. But the back and forth had left him drained, his mind swirling with the weight of unfinished business and the constant pressure to perform under the spotlight of national scrutiny. At 70 years old, he carried the accumulated fatigue of years spent in public service, from his early days as a lawyer and state treasurer in Louisiana all the way to the halls of the United States Senate. Tonight, though, he wanted no part of that world. He wanted to be just another diner, anonymous and unremarkable, free from handshakes, photo requests, or the knowing glances that came with his title. No staffers hovering nearby, no reporters waiting outside, and certainly no expectations to live up to the image of a seasoned politician. All he craved was a quiet corner, a good meal, and the chance to let his thoughts drift back to the simpler life he had left behind in Zachary, Louisiana, the small town where he had grown up amid the humid bayous, the sprawling fields, and the close-knit community that had taught him the true meaning of resilience. The young hostess at the entrance greeted him with a professional smile, her eyes scanning the reservation list without a hint of recognition. Kennedy appreciated that more than she could know. "Say, table for one," he said in his familiar Louisiana drawl, the words rolling out easy and unpretentious. "Somewhere quiet in the corner, if you've got it." She nodded and led him through the dining room, past tables where laughter and clinking glasses created a low symphony of privilege. The corner table she chose was perfect, tucked away from the main flow of traffic, offering a view of the room without being on display itself. As Kennedy settled into his seat, he let out a long, slow breath, feeling the invisible burden of the day's responsibilities begin to ease just a fraction. This was his small, private rebellion against the machine of Washington politics, a moment to reclaim the ordinary joys that had sustained him through so many campaigns and crises. He thought of the family gatherings back in Zachary, or the way neighbors would share stories over simple suppers without any need for pretense or status. Those memories grounded him, reminding him why he had entered public life in the first place. Not for glory or wealth, but to give voice to people who often felt overlooked by the very system he now helped shape. The waiter approached soon after, and Kennedy placed his order with quiet efficiency, choosing a straightforward meal that suited his tastes without fanfare. When the plate arrived, he took his first bite slowly, closing his eyes for a brief second as the flavors brought a rare sense of contentment. For now, at least, he was simply a man enjoying his dinner, far from the Senate floor and the endless cycle of negotiations. The evening unfolded in peaceful rhythm at first, the restaurant's ambient sounds providing a soothing backdrop to his reflections. Kennedy allowed his mind to wander further into the past, recalling the winding roads of his home state, the way the Mississippi River carved through the landscape like a living artery, and the resilience of the people who called Louisiana home. He remembered the early mornings in Zachary as a boy, helping out with whatever tasks needed doing, learning that life rewarded those who showed up and worked hard no matter the odds. Those lessons had carried him through law school, through building a career in the legal field, and eventually into the unpredictable arena of politics. Even now, after all these years, he felt a deep pull toward that simpler world. A place where a person's worth was measured not by titles or connections, but by their integrity and willingness to listen. In Washington, however, the rules were different. Here, perception often trumped reality, and a single misstep could define a career. That was why he cherished evenings like this, one where he could fade into the background and simply be. But the calm was not destined to last. The front doors swung open once more, admitting a couple whose arrival shifted the subtle energy of the room. Michael Harrington, a tall and commanding figure in his mid-40s, with the confident bearing of a successful businessman, strode forward alongside his wife, Elizabeth. They moved with the assurance of people accustomed to getting what they wanted, their presence immediately drawing the hostess's attention. Michael approached the stand with purposeful steps, offering a crisp business card as he spoke. "Table for two by the window, preferably," he said, his voice carrying that polished, authoritative tone common among those who navigated the upper echelons of D.C. society. "We're frequent guests here, and I know the owner quite well." The hostess consulted her chart, her expression turning apologetic as she explained the situation. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Harrington, but all the window tables are reserved this evening. We can have something ready in about 20 to 25 minutes, or perhaps another option in the meantime." Michael's features tightened slightly, a flicker of impatience crossing his face as he processed the delay. Elizabeth, standing gracefully beside him, let her gaze sweep across the dining room with deliberate care, to her eyes pausing on the back corner where Kennedy sat alone at his modest table. She leaned in closer to the hostess, lowering her voice, but not enough to keep the words entirely private in the hushed atmosphere. "Couldn't you suggest to the gentleman in the corner that he might be more comfortable at the bar, or somewhere smaller? He's dining by himself anyway, and it seems like he could easily adjust. It would free up a much better spot for us right away." The request hung in the air like an unspoken judgment, laced with the casual assumption that the lone diner in the shadows held less claim to the space than they did. The hostess shifted uncomfortably, her professional composure cracking under the pressure. "Madam, I'm afraid it wouldn't be right to ask a guest to move like that. We try to accommodate everyone without disrupting their experience." Michael stepped in then, his tone firm yet measured, the kind that suggested this was a matter easily resolved with the right influence. "Come on now. We've supported this place for years. Just have a quiet word with him. Tell him the bar area is livelier or whatever fits. It won't take more than a couple of minutes." Elizabeth nodded in agreement, her expression one of practical expectation rather than malice, as if rearranging the room's seating was the most logical solution in their world of priorities and preferences. The exchange continued in hushed but insistent tones, the couple's words carrying across the short distance to where Kennedy remained seated. From his corner table, John Neely Kennedy had heard every syllable. His years in the Senate had sharpened his ability to listen, not just to speeches and testimonies, but to the undercurrents of human interaction that revealed so much about character and circumstance. He sat motionless for a moment, fork paused above his plate, absorbing the implication behind their request. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet, wistful smile that touched the corners of his mouth, the kind born from long experience with being underestimated. He thought back to his own beginnings in Zachary, where a young man with big dreams but modest means had often faced similar subtle dismissals from those who assumed they knew his limits. Those early days had taught him patience and perspective, qualities that had served him well through every election, every legislative battle, and every moment when the powerful overlooked the quiet strength of ordinary people. In this elegant restaurant, far from the bayous and backroads of Louisiana, the scene unfolding before him felt like a microcosm of the very divides he worked to bridge in Congress, the gap between those who saw status as the ultimate measure and those who valued the journey and the heart behind it. Kennedy's mind drifted to the constituents he represented, the farmers, teachers, and small business owners who never asked for special treatment but simply wanted a fair shot. He wondered how many times they had felt the same sting of being judged unworthy of a seat at the table, literally or figuratively. Yet here he was, a senator who had earned his place through decades of service. I now cast in the role of the inconspicuous stranger whose presence was deemed inconvenient. The hostess glanced nervously toward his table, clearly torn between protocol and the insistent pressure from the Harringtons. Kennedy maintained his calm demeanor, his sad smile lingering as he took another slow sip from his glass. He had no intention of causing a scene or demanding recognition. That was never his way. Instead, he simply observed, reflecting on how life had a way of presenting these small tests of character, moments that revealed more about others than they ever intended. The tension in the room thickened subtly, the whispers creating ripples that only he seemed fully attuned to in that isolated corner. His thoughts turned once more to home, to the resilience he had learned growing up and the values he hoped to uphold in his public role. This evening, which had promised simple peace, was now layered with an unexpected undercurrent of human frailty and assumption. Kennedy remained seated, his expression steady, waiting without haste as the hostess began to move hesitantly in his direction. The night was young, and whatever came next, he knew it would unfold in its own time, just as so many chapters of his life had before. As the subtle tension in Lane 3 continued to build under the bright lights of the Lafayette Safeway, with Harold Whitaker still standing there with his weathered hands hovering uncertainly over his modest groceries and the faint tremor in his fingers revealing the quiet weight of embarrassment he was carrying, Senator John Neely Kennedy felt a deep, an unmistakable pull from within, the kind of instinctive call to action rooted in the Louisiana values he had been raised with. The belief that real strength wasn't found in grandstanding or waiting for someone else to step up, but in quietly doing what was right when the moment demanded it. And without a second of hesitation, he stepped forward from his place in line, his casual jeans and button-down shirt still making him look like any other local rather than a United States senator. And in that calm, straightforward voice that had become his trademark both in the Senate chamber and back home in the parishes, he spoke clearly enough for Ashley the cashier and Harold to hear. "Ring it all up together," he said simply, placing his steaming cup of black coffee and the newspaper on the belt right behind Harold's items. "To his groceries and mine." One transaction. Ashley looked up with a flicker of surprise in her eyes, her hands pausing over the register as she processed the unexpected request, while Harold turned slowly, his face shifting from embarrassment to confusion as he met Kennedy's steady gaze. "Sir, I can't let you do that," Harold began, his voice cracking slightly with the pride of a man who had served his country and wasn't accustomed to accepting help, especially not from a stranger in the middle of a busy morning store. "I appreciate it, but I don't want charity. I'll just put the lunch meat back like I said." Kennedy offered a small, genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes and carried the easy warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime talking with folks across Louisiana's bayous and small towns. And he replied in that no-nonsense yet kind Louisiana drawl that made his words feel both firm and reassuring. "You're not letting me do anything, friend. I'm buying my coffee and my paper anyway, and your items happen to be right there in front of mine on the belt. That's just how checkout lines work in Louisiana. We look out for each other without making a big fuss about it." He nodded gently toward Ashley, encouraging her to proceed, and as she scanned the milk and lunch meat back into the total along with Kennedy's coffee and newspaper, the senator reached for his wallet with the same unassuming calm he brought to every part of his life. Harold stood there blinking, still processing the moment, his faded Army veteran cap slightly askew as he tried to find the words to protest again. But Kennedy continued speaking softly, his tone carrying the deep respect he had always shown for those who had worn the uniform. "What branch were you in?" he asked, keeping the conversation natural and respectful, the kind of question that came from a man who truly wanted to know rather than just fill the silence. Harold, caught off guard by the genuine interest, answered automatically, his voice gaining a touch of quiet pride. "Army, Vietnam, 68 to 70. Kennedy's expression softened with sincere admiration, the kind that came from years of listening to veterans' stories during town halls and community events across Louisiana, and he replied without hesitation, "Thank you for your service, sir. That's something no one can ever take away from you." The words landed with quiet power, not as political rhetoric, but as the heartfelt acknowledgement of one American to another who had sacrificed in ways most people could only imagine. And Harold nodded slowly, his eyes misting slightly as the weight of the simple gratitude settled over him. By now, the total had come up on the register, $22 and change, and Kennedy handed over his card without fanfare, the transaction processing smoothly, while Ashley kept her professional composure, even as she began to sense there was something more to this customer than met the eye. The line behind them had grown longer, but the earlier mutters of impatience had quieted into curious silence as a few shoppers started to notice the unusual exchange unfolding in Lane 3. See the soft southern morning light filtering through the store windows and casting a gentle glow over the scene. Kennedy turned back to Harold, his voice remaining low and reassuring so as not to draw unnecessary attention. "You go ahead and take your groceries, and have a good day. That's all that matters here." Harold accepted the separate receipt Ashley handed him, still looking a bit stunned, his hands no longer trembling quite as much now that the immediate pressure of the shortage had been lifted. Yet he hadn't yet connected the dots about who this helpful stranger truly was. The baseball cap, the casual clothes, and the humble demeanor had kept Kennedy's identity hidden for the moment. Inside, Kennedy felt a profound sense of rightness. This wasn't about scoring points or making headlines. It was about living out the Louisiana spirit he believed in so strongly. The idea that when you see someone struggling, especially a veteran who had given so much for the country, you don't just stand by and watch, you act with quiet decency because that's what decent people do. His thoughts drifted briefly to the many veterans he had met throughout Lafayette and the surrounding parishes, Men and women whose stories of service and subsequent challenges had shaped his legislative priorities back in Washington. And this simple act in the Safeway felt like a direct extension of those values. A reminder that leadership wasn't only about bills and speeches, but about the everyday moments where human connection mattered most. The store's familiar sounds, the beeps of other registers, the soft Cajun-inflected conversations in nearby aisles, and the occasional page over the intercom, continued around them, but the atmosphere in Lane 3 had begun to shift noticeably, a subtle warmth spreading as a couple of customers exchanged quiet glances, sensing that something genuine and kind was happening right in front of them. Harold picked up his now paid-for bag of groceries, still murmuring his thanks under his breath, his pride intact because Kennedy had framed the help not as charity, but as a simple, practical courtesy between fellow Louisianans. Kennedy grabbed his own coffee and newspaper, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came from doing the right thing without needing recognition, his mind already reflecting on how these small acts of compassion could ripple outward in ways no one could fully predict. Reinforcing his lifelong belief that America's strength lay in its people looking out for one another, especially for those who had defended the nation's freedoms. As the two men stood there for a brief moment at the end of the checkout, the morning bustle of the Lafayette Safeway flowing on around them, Kennedy's presence remained low-key and unassuming. Yet the seeds of something larger had been planted in that ordinary grocery store aisle, a moment of quiet humanity that would soon touch more lives than either man could have imagined, all beginning with a single, straightforward decision to step forward and say, "I've got this," in the true spirit of Louisiana community and respect for those who had served. The transaction was complete. The groceries were bagged. Harold Whitaker walked away from the counter with his basic necessities now taken care of, still unaware of the full identity of the man who had just made his morning lighter, while Senator John Neely Kennedy followed a few steps behind, carrying his coffee and reflecting deeply on the power of simple kindness in a world that too often forgot the quiet struggles of its veterans, his heart steady with the knowledge that he had lived out his values in the most unassuming way possible on this ordinary morning in Lafayette. The conversation had settled into a comfortable rhythm when the waiter returned to the table carrying a fresh glass of water for Kennedy. He set it down carefully and smiled with the easy familiarity of someone who had served many regulars over the years. "Anything else I can get for you right now, Senator Kennedy?" he asked politely. "Or would you like to see the dessert menu?" The words landed on the table like a quiet thunderclap. Michael Harrington's hand froze halfway to his wine glass. Elizabeth's fork paused in midair, a delicate piece of asparagus balanced on its tines. For a long second, neither of them moved or spoke. The name Senator Kennedy hung in the air between them, echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over their corner of the restaurant. Senator Kennedy. Michael's mind raced, replaying every word he and Elizabeth had spoken since they sat down. The casual questions, the subtle assumptions, the comment about his son Daniel chasing an unrealistic dream in politics. The way they had tried to have this man moved from his table like an inconvenience. Now, the pieces clicked into place with brutal clarity. And this wasn't some retired local official or mid-level staffer. This was John Neely Kennedy, the Republican senator from Louisiana, known across the country for his plain-spoken style, his sharp wit during hearings, and his unwavering defense of constitutional principles. Elizabeth's face drained of color. Her perfectly composed expression cracked, replaced by a look of dawning horror. She stared at the man across from them, really seeing him for the first time. The calm blue eyes, the slight southern drawl that had seemed merely quaint moments ago, the quiet confidence that never needed to announce itself. How had they missed it? How had they sat here for nearly an hour treating a United States senator like an unimportant stranger who didn't belong in their world? Michael cleared his throat, his voice suddenly hoarse. Senator? Kennedy? John Neely Kennedy? Kennedy set his fork down gently and met their eyes with the same steady, unassuming gaze he had shown all evening. There was no triumph in his expression, no smug satisfaction at their discomfort, only a quiet understanding, the kind that comes from a lifetime of watching people realize they had misjudged someone. Yes, he said simply, his Louisiana accent warm and unchanged. That's me. The silence stretched again, heavier this time. Michael's face had turned a deep shade of red. Elizabeth's eyes glistened with the first hint of tears she was desperately trying to hold back. The elegant restaurant around them continued its soft murmur of conversation and clinking silverware, completely unaware that at this small corner table, an entire evening's worth of assumptions had just collapsed. We had no idea, Michael stammered, his commanding presence from earlier evaporating. When we asked the hostess, when we suggested you move, I'm so sorry. That was completely out of line. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly, her voice trembling. Senator, please forgive us. We were rude. We made assumptions based on nothing but our own arrogance. I feel terrible. Kennedy raised a hand gently, cutting off the rush of apologies before they could spiral further. His tone remained calm and fatherly, the same voice he used when speaking to young people back home who felt lost or discouraged. Don't beat yourselves up too hard, he said. I've sat through enough Senate hearings to know that people make snap judgments every single day. It's human nature. What matters is what we do, after we realize we were wrong. He paused, taking a slow sip of water, as if gathering his thoughts. When he continued, his words carried the weight of decades of lived experience rather than political talking points. Let me tell you a little more about where I come from, he began. I grew up in Zachary, Louisiana, a small town most folks in Washington have never heard of. My family didn't have much. We worked hard, went to church on Sundays, and believed that a man's word was his bond. I wasn't born with connections or a silver spoon. I had to earn every opportunity the old-fashioned way, through study, persistence, and a whole lot of doors slammed in my face along the way. Michael and Elizabeth listened in rapt silence now, their earlier condescension replaced by genuine attention. Kennedy's voice stayed even, never rising for dramatic effect, though yet every sentence carried quiet power. I remember being a young lawyer driving between rural courthouses, sometimes representing people who couldn't afford fancy attorneys. There were plenty of times when folks looked at me and saw just another small-town kid who didn't belong in the room. I got underestimated more times than I can count, but I kept showing up. I kept listening. And eventually, the people of Louisiana gave me the chance to serve them. First as state treasurer, then in the Senate. It wasn't glamorous. It was hard work, long hours, and learning to speak truth, even when it wasn't popular. He looked directly at Michael, his expression kind but serious. You mentioned your son Daniel earlier. 17 years old and already thinking about getting into public service. That's not something to dismiss lightly. Politics isn't about glamour or easy money. It's about showing up for people who feel forgotten. It's about having the courage to fight for what's right even when the cameras aren't rolling. If Daniel has that fire in him, don't put it out. Guide him, sure. Teach him the realities of the game. But don't tell him it's impossible or unworthy. Some of the best leaders I've known started exactly where he is right now. Young, idealistic, and determined to make a difference. Elizabeth wiped at the corner of her eye with her napkin, no longer trying to hide her emotion. "We were so wrong about you tonight, Senator. The way we spoke, the way we looked at you, it was inexcusable." Kennedy shook his head gently. "I've been on the receiving end of that look before, back when I was just starting out. It stings, but it also teaches you something important. Never judge a person by the table they're sitting at, or the way they speak, or how quietly they carry themselves. Real value runs deeper than surface appearances. I've seen millionaires who couldn't lead a prayer meeting and farmers who understood more about honest government than most people in this city." Michael sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. The confident businessman who had walked into the restaurant demanding the best table now looked like a man confronting his own blind spots. "I've spent years building my company, judging people by their titles, their watches, their addresses. Tonight you've shown me how shallow that can be. I owe you an apology, Senator. A real one." Kennedy smiled, the same warm, slightly mischievous smile he had worn when he first invited them to sit down. "Apology accepted. But let's not stop at sorry. Take that lesson home to Daniel. Tell him his dad met an old senator from Louisiana who started with less than most people and still found a way to serve. Tell him the door is open if he wants to walk through it, but he'll have to earn it every single day, just like the rest of us." The tension at the table had transformed. What began as awkward embarrassment had slowly shifted into something deeper, a moment of honest reflection between three people who, only an hour earlier, had seemed to inhabit completely different universes. Kennedy continued speaking softly, sharing a few more stories from his early career. The campaign where his car broke down on a dirt road and a farmer stopped to help. The late-night town halls where he listened to single mothers worry about healthcare costs. Not the quiet satisfaction of passing legislation that actually helped real families back home. As he talked, Michael and Elizabeth found themselves nodding, truly listening for the first time all evening. The senator's words weren't preachy or self-important. They were grounded, practical, and delivered with the same straightforward honesty that had made him a respected voice in the Senate. For the first time, they saw beyond the corner table and the unassuming demeanor. They saw the journey of a man who had risen through grit, integrity, and an unshakable belief in the American promise. The same promise he hoped the next generation, including their son Daniel, would continue to fight for. The evening had taken a turn none of them had expected when they first sat down together, and though the main course was nearly finished, the most important part of the night, the part that would echo far beyond these restaurant walls, was only just beginning to take root. As the evening drew to a close, the waiter approached the table with the check. Senator John Neely Kennedy reached for it without hesitation, sliding his card across the leather folder before Michael could react. "Senator, please, let us take care of this," Michael said quickly, his voice still carrying the weight of embarrassment from earlier. "After everything tonight, it's the least we can do." Kennedy shook his head with a gentle but firm smile. "I've got it. This wasn't a lesson with a price tag, Michael. We shared a meal and a conversation. That's enough. Consider it my treat." Elizabeth looked down at her hands, her earlier poise replaced by quiet humility. "Thank you, Senator. Not just for dinner, but for how you handled us. Most people in your position would have made us feel even smaller." Kennedy leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "I've made plenty of my own mistakes over the years, some bigger than others. What I've learned is that grace costs nothing and usually pays the biggest dividends. Besides, I enjoyed the company more than I expected when the night began." The three of them stood up together as the restaurant began to quiet down. Michael shook Kennedy's hand with genuine respect, no longer the commanding businessman who had demanded the best table. Elizabeth offered a warm, sincere thank you, her eyes still carrying traces of emotion. As they parted ways outside the restaurant, the cool Washington night air felt different, heavier with reflection, and lighter with possibility. 3 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived at Senator Kennedy's office in the Russell Senate Office Building. The return address was from Michael Harrington in Virginia. Kennedy opened it during a quiet moment between meetings, pulling out a handwritten letter and a small photograph. The letter was long, written in neat, careful script. Dear Senator Kennedy, I've started this letter 3 different times and finally decided to just speak from the heart. That night at the Hawthorne Club changed something in me and in our family. When I got home, I sat down with my son Daniel and told him everything that happened. I didn't sugarcoat it. I admitted how we judged you by appearances, how we tried to have you moved, and how wrong we were. For the first time in a long while, I saw real respect in my son's eyes when he looked at me. Not because I'm successful in business, but because I was honest about my mistake. Daniel is 17 and full of dreams about public service. He wants to study political science and maybe run for local office one day. Before that night, I kept steering him toward business school, telling him politics was too dirty, too thankless, and not worth the sacrifice. After hearing your story, how you rose from a small town in Louisiana through hard work and integrity, I realized I was robbing him of the chance to find his own path. We've started listening to each other differently. Every evening now, Daniel and I sit down and talk about current events, about what leadership really means, and about the kind of country we want to help build. And it's loud sometimes, and we don't always agree, but it's real. The gap between us has narrowed in ways I didn't think possible. Senator, you didn't just teach me a lesson about humility that night. You reminded me that the most important things in life, character, service, and family, can't be measured by bank accounts, addresses, or the tables we sit at in fancy restaurants. I've spent years chasing success in the wrong ways. You showed me there's a better way. Enclosed is a photo of Daniel. He asked me to include it. He's holding the book he's reading about American history and says he wants to write you a letter himself soon. If you ever have time, he would be honored to meet you one day. Not as a fan, but as a young man trying to learn from someone who has walked the road with honesty. Thank you again. Your grace that evening meant more than you'll ever know. Sincerely, Michael Harrington Kennedy unfolded the photograph. It showed a smiling 17-year-old boy with bright eyes and an open, hopeful expression. In the background was a desk covered with books on government and history. The image brought a quiet smile to the senator's face. Later that evening, back at his residence, Kennedy shared the letter with his wife. She read it slowly, then looked up at him with the familiar mix of pride and gentle amusement she had carried through their long marriage. "You know, John," she said softly, "you have a way of turning even the worst first impressions into something good. Most people would have let that couple walk away embarrassed and never think twice. You turned it into a moment that might shape a young man's future." Kennedy folded the letter carefully and set it on his desk. "I didn't do anything special. I just remembered where I came from. A kid from Zachary who got underestimated more times than I can count. If someone had given up on me back then, I wouldn't be here today. The least I can do is pass that same chance along." He paused, looking out the window toward the lights of the capital city. "That's the real lesson here, one you won't find written neatly in any textbook or campaign manual. Never judge a person by the surface. Not by how they look, not by where they sit, not by the first impression they give. Real worth runs much deeper. It's found in the journey they've traveled, the obstacles they've overcome, and the quiet strength they show when no one is watching. Kennedy turned back to his wife, his voice carrying the steady conviction that had defined his career. In this city, in this country, we're too quick to sort people into categories: important or unimportant, powerful or ordinary, worthy or unworthy. But every single one of us started somewhere. Every leader was once a kid with a dream someone could have easily dismissed. Every good citizen carries a story of struggle and perseverance that deserves respect. He tapped the letter gently. Michael and Elizabeth learned that lesson the hard way. But they learned it. And now their son Daniel gets to grow up knowing that his dreams matter, that public service is honorable work, and that even a senator from a small Louisiana town can sit at the same table and treat everyone with basic human dignity. The senator smiled, a touch of his trademark wit returning. Besides, if a plain-spoken old boy from Zachary can still surprise folks in Washington after all these years, there's still hope for this republic yet. As he placed the letter and photograph in a drawer for safekeeping, John Neely Kennedy felt a quiet satisfaction, not the kind that comes from winning a debate or passing a bill, but the deeper kind that comes from knowing one small act of kindness and honesty had rippled outward, touching a family and perhaps shaping a young man's future. In the end, the most expensive lesson Michael Harrington ever received wasn't written on any balance sheet or real estate deal. It was the simple truth that pride can blind us, but humility and respect can open doors we never knew existed. And that truth, the one about never judging a book by its cover or a senator by his quiet corner table, is a lesson worth carrying far beyond any restaurant, any city, or any single evening. It is a lesson for all of us.